All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July California-Nevada Drought Early Warning System Drought and Climate Outlook Webinar. Thank you for those that have joined us previously and those that may be joining us for the first time. My name is Amanda Sheffield, and I'm the Regional Drought Information Coordinator for California and Nevada with NIDIS. This webinar is co-hosted with the California-Nevada Adaptation Program and NOAA CAPRISA team. This webinar is part of a bi-monthly series we designed to provide the region with timely information on current drought status and associated impacts, as well as a preview of developing climatic events. Before we get started, I just want to note for folks that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and a brief summary will be available on drought.gov and our YouTube channel later this week. We've got a great set of speakers this week. You can see on the screen, and I'll go into details a little bit later. But first, I just want to share a couple things before we get started. For those that don't know us, we'll just take a few minutes to introduce NIDIS. Our mission is to improve the nation's capacity to proactively manage drought-related risks by providing those affected with the best available information and resources to assess the potential for drought and to better prepare for, mitigate, and respond to the effects of drought. We work to improve our understanding of how and why drought affects society, the economy, the environment, and improve access and dissemination and use of early warning information for drought risk management. We do this by working with our on-the-ground partners, including those in new and existing networks of federal, tribal, state, local, and academic partners to make this climate and drought science accessible and useful for decision-making. Here's just a little bit more about the drought early warning systems, which California, Nevada is one of them. It is what we call a system that collects and integrates information on key indicators of drought in order to make it usable, reliable, and timely for different parts of drought. So observation, monitoring, planning, preparedness, prediction and forecasting, communication and outreach, and interdisciplinary research and actions. And one example of that is a webinar such as this. Just a few announcements on things that NIDIS has released that you may be interested in. If you go to drought.gov, at the top there's usually a header of new news or things coming out. One I just wanted to mention was a new drought and public health roadmap we've released, which outlines key opportunities for advancing engagement and preparedness between drought and the public health sector. Through a series of meetings, interviews over the last 2 years, we've documented things and included in here the insights into the connection between drought events and human health impacts, and then a list of key opportunities and recommended actions that we hope will inform and direct future efforts and investments across the federal, family, state, local agencies, all the above. In there. And if you go to drought.gov, you can find that there and read more about it and what we've been up to. And then also, if you are working in the area of soil moisture, this is sort of a short turnaround because the registration, it's been out for a little while, but the registration is due by July 30th. But the 2023 National Soil Moisture Workshop is coming up in August. It is mostly in person, but has a few limited virtual options as well. But it provides a unique opportunity for those involved in soil moisture research, monitoring, and applications to come together in an interactive format to exchange ideas and develop collaborations across their area of interest and with the user community. This is the 14th consecutive year for this workshop, and this is just the next one coming up, and you can find information at this link or just go to events on drought.gov. And with that, we'll get into our great speakers that we have today. First, we're going to have a drought and climate update and outlook, and then a presentation on some work coming from Steph McAfee, who's the Nevada State Climatologist and Partners on improving Nevada's drought and climate monitoring network, and then an aerial detection survey program update from Nick from US Forest Service. And with that, I'll pass to our first presentation, which I said was the drought and climate update and outlook, who's with Julie Kalansky, who's part of CNAP CW3 at Scripps at UC San Diego. And Julie, with that, I'll pass control over to you.
Great, thanks, Amanda. I haven't seen the control come through.
Oh, nope, I got to hit okay. Sorry, a little slow.
All right, yep, okay. There we go, great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about what's going on in terms of the current climate, and this is what we're seeing, at least from what I've been seeing in quite a few places. You know, the trees are still pretty green from the relatively wet winter in the forested area, and you can barely see it here as some of the streams and rivers are still running. So This is the Drought Monitor as of last Thursday, and as you can see in both California and Nevada, there's only a little bit of D1 and D0. So here in California, it's there's about 75% that there's no drought throughout the state, and in Nevada, there's about 79%. And whereas, and just looking at how much this has changed. So this is just looking at over the last 8 weeks, so approximately 2 months, and we can see for much of kind of the central Nevada area, there's been a 1-class improvement. There have been a couple places in California where you've seen 1-class degradation in the drought conditions throughout the region. And this is just a reminder of the change since the start of the water year. And so if in large swaths of the area, 4 to 5 class improvements, 3 in the large majority of it. I will say, except the southeast region, which hasn't been as wet as much of the rest of the region. So temperature has been a big story recently. I've shown on the previous webinar how this water year overall was relatively cool, and that was throughout the entire West, not just the California and Nevada region. And this continued through May, and in parts of June, we were starting to see it warm up a little bit, but this is now just looking at the last 30 days, which is far here on the left, and this is from the Climate Toolbox. Last 15 days to last 7 days, and you can see how it has warmed up, and the anomaly, so the above climatology has increased from the last month to the last week, and now over the last 7 days, we've seen, throughout much of the region, a 4 to 6 degree anomaly, and just how warm it's been. There's definitely some exceptions along the coast. It's generally been cooler. More recently, even, it was below normal for the coast of Southern California. And then parts of Eastern Nevada aren't quite as warm as we're seeing throughout the rest of the state, or the regions. With this increasing temperature, what we're also seeing is this increase in evaporative demand. And so I've talked about evaporative demand previously on the webinars, but what this is really the thirst of the atmosphere. And so if there was unlimited amount of water, how much water would be evaporating from the land. And so overall, like I mentioned, this year has been relatively cool, and the evaporative demand in these cool colors has been relatively low. And so the atmosphere hasn't been drying out the landscape as much overall for this water year, but that is even this last month. Again, this southeast region has been a bit of an exception, but for large parts of the region, it's been kind of in this near normal to actually below normal. Whereas in this last week, we're really starting to see that evaporative demand increase through large parts of the region, and we're not seeing many of those blue colors except in some of those coastal locations. And so what this is saying is that as the air dries, and it's not just temperature, but temperature is a component, it's temperature, wind, humidity, and downward solar radiation, we're seeing there be this increase in this evaporative demand, which leads to the drying out of the landscape. That being said, if we're looking at soil moisture, and this is the topsoil moisture, it's still kind of in this, throughout much of the region, kind of in this 30 to 70% normal range, or even in some areas, it's moister than it would be normally for this time of year. And part of it is that the evaporative demand, although it's starting to increase over the last week, takes a longer period of time. And then also, what in some locations, this is from the California Nevada River forecasts, this is looking at snow and is in inches, and some of these higher elevations, given how much snow there was this year, there is still a little bit of snow remains. I was talking to a colleague who 2 weekends ago was skiing in Mammoth still, which is, being in July is pretty remarkable. And I just thought, because last time at our webinar, there was still quite a bit of snowpack. And so for the different parts in California, just looking at how the final melt out of the snowpack compared to at least 82, 83, and you can see it was relatively steep, especially in the south. Once we hit kind of mid-May, you see this really quick melt out of much of the snowpack. And in the central and northern, it was kind of, I would say, more similar to what was to the other big year in 1982 and 83. With all that snow melting, the next question is, well, so how are our streams doing? And so this is looking from USGS at different stream gauges throughout both California and Nevada. And that the dots are the different stream gauges, and this is a percentile class. And so if you look here, we're seeing, you know, greens, light blues, and blues, and a lot of kind of this darker blue throughout around the Sierras. And so a lot either within the normal or above normal range. There are the exceptions of streams that are below there, but overall stream flows are still relatively high or normal for this time of the year throughout both California and Nevada. In looking at reservoir levels, and so this is looking at the western reservoirs in the Sierra Nevada, both large and small for California. And this figure is by Mike Dedinger, and the blue line is showing what's normal for reservoirs, and the gray line is looking at the snowpack. And the idea of this is because so water can be stored as snowpack in our Sierra Nevadas, and is that it's a storage, so reservoir in itself. And so really looking at them together gives us better indication of where our overall storage is for parts of the region. And so obviously this year we have that massive snowpack, which you're seeing in the yellow line. And that is mostly since melted out, as I showed, and the reservoirs have increased quite substantially. And so, you know, they have pretty much doubled, if you look at all 28 western reservoirs, where they were prior to this year to where they are now in terms of the storage. Looking at Lake Tahoe, a similar story. It started at parts of the year below the rim, and then with the massive snowpack that we got this year, it has, you know, it's gone up to almost 600,000 acre feet, and with most of the snow melting out. One thing that was a big topic in California this year was the Tulare Lake, the development of the Tulare Lake, given the massive snowpack in the southern Sierras and the Tulare Basin. And so now that the snowpack has melted out, as you can see here, the reservoirs are pretty much at capacity. And this was, I didn't have anything updated through July or couldn't find anything, but you can see the differences between the two, and some of the projections show in terms of the amount of flooding and the depth. They were able to manage it such that there was less, the depth of the flooding was not as great, especially around the borders of Tulare Lake. Now, another important part to our region is the Colorado River Basin. And this, I will explain all these figures because there's quite a bit going on, but this is just looking at Lake Powell since January of 2019. And here you're looking at Lake Mead since January of 2019. And you can see that this year, this increase in Lake Powell has really shot up. So it's 2.44 million acre feet more than last year. And I should say these figures are from Metropolitan Water District, and you can find them here. Whereas, so the storage in Lake Powell has increased, Lake Mead hasn't increased as rapidly, and that has to do with the management between the two reservoirs. And so if you look here, like I mentioned, there's a lot going on in this figure. It's very similar to the previous figures that I showed in terms of reservoir storage. If you just follow these red lines, here's a reservoir storage in 20 upstream reservoirs on the Colorado River, and then the snowpack in those water basins. And so, you know, started near 5 million acre feet and have ended at normal, which is, you know, about 7 from this snowpack. But then once you add on the storage in Powell on top of that, you can see how much it has really increased. So started, you know, just above 10, and then have since gone up to about 17 million acre feet. And now that snow is mostly all melted out. So this is an indication kind of that evolution of the Colorado system throughout the winter and now into summer. And then this is looking at from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, what their current forecast is for the Colorado. So it's 10,700,000 acre feet. And so here's this possible between minimum and maximum. Here's where the historical average is. So you can see how well above that historical average this year has been for the Colorado. I'm going to change briefly to fire danger, given how wet this year has been throughout much of California. The fire danger is low to moderate, though in some of the places, especially the southeast, you're getting into, there are some areas that are high, whereas within the Great Basin, we're seeing some very high to extreme for fire danger. And then now I'm going to actually start to look at the outlook side of things. And so this is the temperature forecast. What I'm showing here on the left is just for August. And these colors are an indication of how likely it is to be above normal. And so what we see throughout much of the region is that it's leaning to be above normal, or kind of that on that cusp of likely above normal. In California and Nevada throughout August. And I like to show that the month ahead, because it does take into that the 2-week forecast, where we traditionally have a little bit more skill than the longer lead times. So this is now looking at the 3-month, and overall in that 3-month, they still need to be above normal. So August, September, October. And these were both issued late last week. I'm showing precipitation for August for the monthly precipitation outlook, because in part because of the monsoon and how dry the southeast corner has been. I will say there is very, very little skill for the precipitation monthly forecast, but so having said all that, it is leaning towards to being below normal, whereas other places equal chances. Again, this is difficult to predict. The last thing I will show before I actually start talking about El Nino, because that's big, is the fire potential outlook. And I'm just showing it for August. And you can see other months here. I will say September looks extremely similar to August, where for much of our California and Nevada region, it is normal. Parts of the Central Valley and Central Sierras are a bit below normal, and the northeast corner of Nevada is above normal. So like I mentioned, I would talk about El Nino. We are currently in an El Nino advisory. Here, what you're looking at is the sea surface temperature anomaly in degrees Celsius. And so this is an indication for one of how ENSO is determined is by the sea surface temperature in the tropical Pacific. And you can see how it's grown since the beginning of May, that anomalous warm water. And this is where the forecasts are. Here's June, July, and August. And if you just focus on all these bold lines, the red bold line is from dynamical models. And so those models are kind of a forecasting system that uses computer power to forecast into the future. The statistical model, which is this green line, uses the relationships to forecast the ENSO would be in the future, and the blue line is the CPC climate predictions. And so what you're seeing here is the dynamical models are showing for this winter a much stronger El Nino potentially than the statistical models. And so there's a fair bit of uncertainty, although they both agree there would be some sort of El Nino, whether it might be a weak or strong El Nino. And just as a reminder,
Julie, could you talk up a little louder? We're getting a little bit of background noise.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, of course. And so just looking at this is El Nino and La Niña, and the color dots are indicating what phase it is. And this is looking at the October through March precipitation for the South Coast. The South Coast and in general, the southern part of the Southwest is where we see the stronger relationship between ENSO and wintertime precipitation. And normal years have a tendency to be wetter than La Nina years. Although obviously this didn't pan out for this last year, whereas in the northern parts of the region, there's not that strong of a relationship. And just to show, here's for weak El Niños, how variable El Niño precipitation can be throughout history. You see some years where it's very wet, some years where it's dry, some years where it's very dry, where it's different throughout the state. And so even though there is the forecast for an El Niño this winter, there is still quite a lot of variability in what this winter may bring. The last thing I will end with is, I know we're talking about drought, which tendency has to do with precipitation, but I do think it's important just to mention that El Niños are associated with higher sea level. And so this is looking at the percent of extreme sea level during El Niños and La Niñas. And so from strong to weak moderate El Niño down to La Niña. And so for the absolute, and this is taking into kind of tides and everything else, versus anomalous, which is on top of what the tides up and down would be, we really see some of the highest sea levels during strong and weak El Niños. I put a link down here. This is a website where you can actually see the anomaly over time above what the tides would be, so you can see how that changes throughout the year. So I will stop there. I just want to wrap up with a couple of the main points, is that during the drought, obviously this year has been significantly mitigated, and it's continued in the last 2 months, especially in Nevada. Northern parts of California and Nevada have been warm for much of the region. The evaporative demand we're starting to see increase, especially this last week. Snow has mostly melted. Stream flows are generally still high throughout the region. Fire danger is high in parts of the Great Basin. It's saying that there's a warm August likely, but fire potential in August and September is normal for much of the region. And we're currently in an El Niño alert, although there's lots of variability of what this might mean for this upcoming winter. So I will stop there and send it back to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Julie. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Steph, who's the Nevada State climatologist, to talk about a project about Nevada's drought and climate monitoring. And all right, folks, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the questions box. We'll probably do all the questions at the end, unless there's quick ones here and there.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I just want to check and make sure that you all can see my screen.
Yes, you look good to go.
Okay, great. Even though we tested it, somehow this doesn't always work. So I'm reporting a bit today on improving Nevada's drought monitoring network. I actually have a picture from last October. This is the Lahontan Reservoir, and you can see it was not in great shape last October. There should be water up over all of those rippled areas. Obviously, it looks very different today, and kind of as we move out of drought, this is actually a good time to be thinking about how to better prepare for the next drought. So this was a NIDIS-funded project to try to get at two overarching questions. The first is the existing drought monitoring network representative of Nevada's landscape, right? Can we accurately and effectively monitor drought in the state? And the second question is, if we find that that is not the case, what are some of the highest priority improvements to Nevada's drought monitoring network? So to get at the first question of, is the existing drought monitoring network actually representative of Nevada's landscape, we started by collecting metadata about weather station networks with publicly available data. And so over on the right, you can see a map showing weather stations in 16 networks that regularly provide data that's adequate for drought monitoring. I'm not going to get into the details of what makes a station adequate for drought monitoring, but if you have questions, feel free to ask. You'll see many of the sort of standards we'd expect up there, ASOS and AWAS, co-op, and things like COCORAS, but also some stations like CASNet and CEMP. and NevCam that are in fact limited, not CastNet, but CMP and NevCam that are more limited to the Nevada area. I think you're already going to see some hints about this station of, is the network representative? Well, no, because there are not that many symbols on that map of a pretty large state. Okay. And so one of the things we then did was compare where the weather stations are to the actual geography of Nevada. So what you're seeing here on the left is a topographic map of Nevada. And now the station network information has been pulled. And what you're actually seeing in the colors is the elevation of the station itself, with lower elevation stations in dark red and higher elevation stations in that pale yellow. And on the right, you see the histogram of the weather stations themselves at the top and the distribution of elevation in Nevada on the bottom. And it turns out actually making a distribution map of the DEM was pretty challenging. You'll notice that little tail off towards the end. But one of the things we see is that, as you might expect, Nevada's weather station network actually undersamples the very highest elevations. You can see we tend not to have a lot of stations out at that 9,000 to 10,000 foot plus area. But we also don't have as many weather stations. You'll see this little bump up here at very low elevation that we're not sampling those as well either. Right. So that means there are some areas in this far southern part of Nevada outside of the Great Basin that are not as effectively sampled. Okay. We also looked at characteristics like aspect. Nevada is by some counts the most mountainous state in the West. And of course, this means we have these multiple vaguely north-south trending weather stations. And one of the things you can kind of see here is, again, we have the counts of weather station by aspect at the top and the sum of area by aspect at the bottom. It's not really surprising that we have overrepresented flat areas. If you've ever had to erect and install a weather station, it's a lot easier doing that on flat ground. But one of the things that is interesting is that there are a couple of aspects, notably the Northwest in that magenta and westerly aspects in that bright royal blue all the way over on the right, where we don't sample those aspects as effectively. And that's actually pretty interesting because this is a storm track that would be pretty common with inside sliders coming into the region. We have also assessed by climate class, and these are the Keppen climate types. Now, unsurprisingly, we see a lot of the BS, which is steppe, BWH, and BWK. Those are kind of the desert types. All of those are well represented in the state. But what's really interesting is we see a lot of weather stations in this DSB class. This is a humid continental climate that you find mostly in the Lake Tahoe area. And you can see that we actually have quite a lot of weather stations sampling that area. So we're really oversampling this pretty unusual climate type. We also looked at where stations are in terms of land ownership. It's perhaps unsurprising, we do have a lot of weather stations on private land. That's pretty common for co-op weather stations. What's interesting is that we also see sort of an unusual number of stations on Forest Service and Department of Energy land, where you can see 51 stations on US Forest Service land, even though it's just over about 5% of the land area in the state. On the other hand, we see far fewer stations on the really vast expanses of BLM land, likely because of access issues. Okay. We also got a sort of mid-project request to assess where weather stations fall within grazing zones. So what you're seeing here in these brown lines are outlining the grazing zones that the NRCS uses, and they're looking just to make sure that there's at least one good weather station in each grazing zone. These largely line up with counties, and for the most part that is true. We have at least one weather station in almost every grazing zone, although when we get down into Esmeralda County and Mineral County, there are very few stations in that area here, sort of south of the Lake Tahoe region along the border with California. Now, it's perhaps unsurprising that most weather stations in Nevada are within 10 miles of a major roadway. So on the right, you see a map of the primary and secondary roads. So these are going to be for the most part, those big paved roads. You can see, for example, Highway 50 in this yellow line going across the middle of the state. You can see Interstate 80 stretching north from Reno towards Winnemucca and then extending out east towards Elko. But we do have a pretty large number of stations that are really well off the road network. So particularly on Nellis Air Force Base, I'm willing to bet there are some roads there that we're just not capturing in the underlying GIS data, but also in some parts of western Elko County up here, sort of north central Nevada, and in parts of far northern Washoe County, right, where Oregon, California, and Nevada come together, and in areas, say, around the Black Rock Desert, which will shortly be full of people setting up for Burning Man. When we look at this with a different road network, right? So this is basically all statewide routes in Nevada. And if you've ever driven around the state, there are an awful lot of things that do qualify as roads. You pretty much will need all-wheel drive access for most of these. And I apologize, I got distracted. I just had a furry helper join me. But, you know, what we see is that most of the existing weather stations do at least have some road access on these really small, often dirt roads. But there are also plenty of places in that sort of blue 5-kilometer buffer, right, where you could access, but there aren't currently any weather stations. So simply lack of access doesn't seem to be the main limiting factor. Certainly in the far northwest parts of the state, we do have some of those large areas with no roads and no weather stations. So another thing we did was put a buffer around the weather stations themselves. So here you can see weather stations surrounded by a 10-mile buffer. And the idea here was, well, a weather station should be reasonably representative of a certain area around it. And I think we can see probably a little less than half of the state falls within 10 miles of a weather station. So in that sort of within those pink blobs. But there are many areas that don't fall within 10 miles of a weather station. Even some areas that are, for example, pretty close to Las Vegas. We see some little triangles of missing area, sort of just northwest of Las Vegas. There are also some decently sized areas in Story County, so just east of Reno, that are in pretty populated areas on a major highway, and yet still lacking a weather station within 10 miles. If we expand this buffer out and go to a 20-mile buffer, obviously we fill in a lot more of those gaps, especially in the populated areas. But there are still some areas, right, not in that green shading, right? That green shading is within 20 miles of a weather station. There are still areas, including on major highways like Highway 50 and even some little parts of Highway 80, where there's no weather station within 20 miles. No, these are small areas. For example, if you look at that space between Lander and Eureka County, there's a little gap where Highway 50 goes through there. And then, of course, in the more remote parts of the state, we have large areas without weather stations. So having gotten a picture of what the network looked like relative to what Nevada looks like, we asked a number of people in the state, what are the highest priority improvements to Nevada's drought monitoring network? And so we had about 13 people who were able to participate in an afternoon work group on Zoom. There were some people who had comments to add as well, but couldn't make that one time. So they provided input offline, either via email or phone call or something like that. And we had participants from the National Weather Service, the Western Regional Climate Center, the Nevada Sagebrush Ecosystem Program, so this is part of the state government, the Nevada Division of Water Resources, the Nevada Department of Wildlife, and the Colorado River Forecast Center, right? So they participated offline. Okay, and when we got everyone together, we asked 3 large questions, and we split up into breakout groups and discussed, and I'm showing, I think, one Jamboard from each breakout group. And so we asked a series of questions. So the first question was, which, if any, existing weather stations, so those dots you already see on the map, should be targeted for improved or expanded drought monitoring? Most of these stations, for example, don't have take soil moisture measurements. Many of them, like the ROS network, are outfitted with precipitation gauges that don't measure snow or frozen precipitation very effectively. So that sort of thing. And you can see people kind of marked things up and left notes with the sticky notes on the side like this. And a couple of the themes that came up across all 3 groups were more soil moisture measurements. This was unsurprising. I feel like every time I talk to anyone in the state of Nevada and they find out I'm the state climatologist, they ask for more soil moisture measurements. People are interested in better telemetry. We have large areas without cell coverage, and that actually can make it difficult to get weather information reliably and in near real time. And then people were also interested in getting more real-time and/or all-weather precipitation gauges. So the kinds of precipitation gauges that can collect data daily and provide that information, right? And that are collecting quality information about rain, snow, hail, sleet, anything that kind of falls out of the sky. We also asked people, what are priority areas for new weather stations? This map had the most circled, but I think people were generally going and circling areas with gaps, places where we've all, I think everyone who works with drought in Nevada has struggled to find information. And so there were a lot of priority areas. However, people also had a lot of plans about how to progress forward with this. And many people wanted to focus on leveraging existing infrastructure and networks. For example, the alert fire camera sites, just to make it easier to put new weather stations out. But they also had ideas about how to make weather station installation palatable, right? Hey, maybe we can put it on highways. Maybe we really shouldn't have areas of our major highways that don't have any weather stations. And we in fact learned that the Elko Weather Forecast Office has a list, but people also pointed out that there were different locations for different needs, but also that there are a lot of weather stations we might not have picked up on. So this was one note here. We know that there are weather stations out there that we might want to get information from, though there might need to be support for data storage and management. For example, gold mines and NDOT. Many of the mines in Nevada are required to collect weather information, but it's not necessarily transmitted regularly. The Department of Transportation runs a road weather information system, and you can get those data, but you have to know to go to the RWIS system. Finally, we asked whether there were high priority areas for ground truthing remotely sensed data or remotely sensed drought monitoring products. I think many of us in Nevada have had the experience of saying, well, the radar says it rained and I can't find any other evidence that it did. Or, wow, there's a lot of water coming down this stream and I don't have good enough radar coverage to see if it rained. So there were really in this two classes of answers, and they were pretty contradictory. One was remote places, places without radar coverage. Or in particular, places on the edge of radar coverage. Let's make sure we know how those remotely sensed drought monitoring products, whether that's NDVI, GRACE soil moisture, anything like that, let's make sure we know how it's doing in those places where realistically we're probably not going to have a long-term weather station anytime remotely soon. But other people suggested that it would actually be great to use some places that are easy to get to as test beds. One area that was pointed out is kind of near Elko in the Lamoille Canyon area. It's actually a really interesting landscape, so we have a lot of different elevations and aspects and land use types and climates all in a pretty small area, and it's relatively easy to get to, so that this could be a great place to test new equipment and new products and see how it's doing in a wide variety of environments without necessarily having to send people out driving for 5 or 6 or 7 hours just to get to a weather station. So when we get to the overall answer of, does Nevada's drought monitoring network adequately track the state? We see that Nevada has about 500 weather stations, and a lot of those are CoCoRaHS stations that go in and out of use over time. And this is spread over about 110,000 square miles. This is one of my favorite pictures of Nevada, which I stole from the med school in the rural medicine group. You can see that we can fit 7 of the New England states plus Delaware in with room to spare, right? So I think we sometimes forget just how large Nevada is. So at some level, the answer is just more stations. But some of the highlights that came out of this were that it would be most helpful to add new stations to especially sparse areas. We know there are some sort of well-covered areas that have a lot of weather stations where we are missing some aspects or elevation bands. And, you know, if we had the resources, it would be nice to evaluate those to see how variable patterns in, say, precipitation distribution with elevation are from year to year. But there are places where we really don't know anything, and so those are a priority. Improving instrumentation and communications would also be a help. We do have stations, weather stations in Nevada that collect data that we can't get for a month or more, which is challenging when you're trying to provide input to the drought monitor on a weekly basis. Conducting more research on the relationship between climate and physiography might help get better predictions out of the existing weather station network. Okay, but there was also a suggestion that we should really be strategic in our approach to network build out. We really don't want to just go for it and put out weather stations that can't be maintained in the long term because of lack of resources or lack of personnel or difficulty in getting there, because then we've actually just wasted some resources putting out a weather station that can't be used long term for drought monitoring. So we're actually just wrapping this up. This morning I was typing away at the final report for the project, but you know, I think we have some ideas about what the next step should be in building out a Nevada weather station network for monitoring drought. So I'm gonna kind of pass this back over to you, Amanda.
Great, thanks, Steph. With that, we'll go to our last presentation, who's Nick from the U.S. Forest Service.
All right, go ahead and share my screen here. Can you see my slides or notes?
We see the note. Oh, now you're good. You're good to go
Okay,
now.
cool. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Muskie. I am the Forest Health Monitoring Program Manager for the Forest Service Region 5. We cover California, Hawaii, and the affiliated Pacific Islands. And our program uses remote sensing and aerial surveys to detect tree mortality across our region. And then today I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of the aerial survey program and some of the widespread mortality we've seen recently, mostly due to the prolonged drought in California, or at least in part. And pardon me, I had an allergy attack and my throat is a little bit shot, so sorry you have to hear me croak this out. So the Aerial Detection Survey Program is a great way of assessing landscape scale trends in tree mortality. Every summer, usually starting at the end of June through the end of the fiscal year, maybe a little bit into October, we fly over all the forested lands in California, with some exceptions like recent fire scars, because we know what killed them, fire. And we fly that on a 4-mile grid transect to assess host composition, damage, mortality. We record damage with a high accuracy GPS on a tablet with this custom survey software. We fly at about 1,000 feet above ground level at about 120 miles an hour. And so for reference, the world goes by at about 5 acres per second. Just a little background on the crew. We have one aerial survey manager, we have one survey specialist, and typically a third contracted surveyor along with a contracted pilot. We used a small fixed wing aircraft like the one in the photo. Usually we get like a turbo Cessna that can handle the higher altitude flights. And this is a little snapshot of what the custom software we use looks like to record mortality. So just use a laser pointer real quick. We load NAPE imagery, which is the National Agricultural Imagery Program that has about a 0.5 meter resolution. We load that up as a background map. And basically just using a stylus, they'll compare to what they're actually seeing on the ground, draw a little polygon or maybe some point data. Then we have these little quick keys which will identify a host and a likely damage causal agent. And then there is basically a percent affected that we'll assign to that, hit apply, and then it's basically on to the next plot. So when we're in the air, we're basically looking for red and yellow foliage. These are likely trees that have been killed or essentially dealt a death blow the year before, but sometimes it takes a little while before there's any indication from the air. So there could be a little bit of a lag effect. And if we're seeing any gray trees, essentially they're all completely defoliated, we make the rough assumption that they've been killed the year before that. So that's how we make the distinctions between recent mortality and previous mortality. So as you're all probably aware, we're coming out of one of the hottest, driest 3-year periods in California since the late 1800s. It's put some tremendous amount of stress on the trees. And overall, I think the state experienced about 76% of its annual precipitation in 2022. But the beginning of the year, it was the driest January through April period based on records dating back to the late 1800s. And California only received about 1/4 of the average statewide precipitation during that time. And this is the really useful snowpack time frame that's crucially missing. And on top of that, a massive persistent heat dome settled over California that was long lasting and intense, setting numerous daily and nightly high temperature records. And then a lot of California didn't receive any precipitation for, I think, a record shattering 212 odd days. And that put Central and Northern California into the exceptional drought category. Now, starting to think of tree mortality as a complex of issues, bark beetles and even native ones can become quite problematic under certain conditions. So if a bark beetle attacks a healthy tree in a healthy stand, it's likely that the pitch or the sap will start flowing, trap the beetle, sort of end of story. But a drought stress tree might not be able to respond effectively. And then if that beetle is successful in its attack, it releases an aggregation pheromone that attracts other beetles. And to kind of complicate things on top of that, a lot of our forests are overcrowded, which causes that aggregation pheromone concentration to build up. There basically isn't proper airflow through the stand to vent it out, and this causes these massive beetle infestations. A little bit more on that in a second. I kind of wanted to touch on diseases for a second. Diseases and pathogens are really, really hard to discern from the air. They definitely require ground checks. But I think it's worth noting, though, that drought also increases the susceptibility to pathogens and more likelihood of mortality. And it's also worth noting that mortality is rarely ever caused by one thing. It's usually a complex of abiotic, climatic conditions, insects, and diseases all working together. The Forest Health Monitoring Program, sort of a national scale, we've all fed data into this, all of our regions. We've put together this data set with areas that are statistically associated with wildfire, bark beetles, and areas that rate higher on the multi-decadal repeat aridity index. Now, there's other factors like host ranges, elevation, topography, and so on and so forth that also could correlate in with this. But you can kind of see how they start to occupy similar areas. So this map is the multi-decadal drought index. And then we can start layering the bark beetle mortality data on top of that. And then the wildfire data on top of that, which is more widespread, but you can kind of start to see this geographic correlation with all these factors. And we're starting to dive into this more in terms of like the specifics of the climatic piece at different elevations and so on and so forth. So maybe invite us back in a year or so, and there'll be more to come on that. So what does all this mean from a management perspective? So traditionally, when we're looking at these bark beetles and the bark beetle pressure, we kind of think of it partially in terms of stand density. If a given stand density is healthy, again, where maybe this beetle has a successful attack on a random dead tree, this aggregation pheromone could be circulated out of the stand, and there might not be any real need for action. You know, these things are native, and so it's just kind of part of the natural process. But once the stand density reaches a certain threshold, beetle mortality or beetle-related mortality starts to increase as stand density goes up. So if the stand density is beyond that, we might want to start knocking it back to this. This stand density index was developed under the sort of previous climate regime, but under wetter conditions, these studies are starting to suggest that under the hotter, drier climate regime, particularly in ponderosa-dominated pine stands, this threshold for stand density is way, way, way lower, and these beetle populations can explode with higher stand density. So this line represents the sort of quote-unquote traditional threshold, and you can see how it's already starting to blow up. And so we're looking at maybe going from a stand density of 200 something to 100. This slide is a meta-analysis of several different studies looking at this stand density issue and threshold. They're basically showing the same info as the last slide, but sort of as a percent survivability ranking between these two climate regimes. So there's a bunch of different studies that basically said the same thing. They found slightly different thresholds, but it should be noted that all these authors were kind of operating in somewhat different areas, but looking at the same species of trees. So, but what we're really looking at though is that under these new climate regimes, stand density is essentially getting cut in half. So we have to remove a lot more trees to keep that beetle pressure down. And this also has a huge amount of implications when considering carbon sequestration. So we're gonna have this weird balance of taking out trees to preserve them, but how do we also effectively manage our forest for carbon sequestration? That's sort of the real crux right now. Getting into the 2022 aerial survey results, we're flying 2023 right now. So we saw elevated levels of tree mortality across about 2.5 million acres, which totals about 36 million dead trees. Most of these trees killed were fir, ponderosas, and Douglas fir. The mortality was particularly bad and widespread in the central Sierras and the northern interior. These numbers are up from about 9.5 million dead trees the previous year. So we're basically at this tipping point with the ongoing effects of the long-term, intermittent, and exceptional drought conditions, along with these subsequent successful bark beetle attacks. Fir mortality was really severe this past year. We've kind of been gallows humor calling it Firmageddon. So 28 million of those 36 million dead trees were fir, and that was scattered over about 2 million acres. This is compared to about 6 million dead trees the year before. So long story short, 3/4 of the mortality this year were various fir species. So some trends in the fir mortality, like I said, most of the mortality was statewide. It continues to be true for in terms of mortality percentage. But early on in the drought, more of the mortality we were seeing was in the lower elevation yellow pines. But as the drought progressed and conditions got worse, so later in the drought, and ever since, we've been seeing fir as the most severely affected. Red fir was heavily affected, and the mortality was often seen in higher elevations, in more homogeneous stands, really concentrated, while the white fir mortality was pretty much statewide across its range, and in mixed conifer forests at a more diffuse intensity. This is just a progression of our overall mortality, tree mortality recorded since 2018. So you can just see how it just really starts to explode in the last couple of years. Just kind of being conscious of the time here. There were a few exceptions actually where mortality events started to decrease, especially in oaks from the pathogen that causes sudden oak death. Now this pathogen prefers wetter conditions, so the drought actually probably temporarily alleviate the situation a little bit. So it's going to be interesting to see in the next couple of years if there's going to be an uptick in sudden oak death, since we got a pretty heavy load of precipitation this past winter. So in summary, you know, many of these trees in these heavily impacted areas are it's going to be a long time if they ever recover from this last major drought. The new mortality that we're seeing so far has been heaviest in the central Sierra Nevada range and further north, just kind of like before. And still true fir species are the ones that are most heavily affected. Like I said, we're finding the 2023 survey right now. I think we're about 40% done. So far, it looks like the mortality is a little bit lighter in these areas, but one wet year isn't really going to stop this train. So we're going to see how it goes, and that stand density issue is still one we're trying to work ourselves around. So now I've left you all on that downer note. I guess I'm ready to take any questions. My email is here, and our aerial survey manager, who's flying right now, can be reached there. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks, Nick. As you said, it's very sobering to see there at the end. I'm going to, and hopefully we'll see this summer's numbers, and we'll be sure whenever your reports come out, we'll send them out through the listservs that go to the folks that listen to these webinars and everything, so they can see the new numbers and see what it looks like. With that, I actually don't see any questions at the moment. I'll give folks a second here and just make some of the closing announcements and things in case we get a question here. First, I want to say thank you all for joining us today and for all our great speakers. We hope you found this webinar informative. I'll mention again that a recording with a brief summary of this webinar will be available on drought.gov and the NICE YouTube channel later this week. And then the next webinar is scheduled for Monday, September 25th. So we have these every 2 months. With that, I don't see, oh, there's one question. And this one would be for you, Nick, that came in. Are there any natural ways to control the beetles?
There are a couple of natural ways. Again, we usually think about it just in forest thinning. A lot of the forests are overstocked, but it's more of like a timber management perspective, but they're overstocked. There's just too many trees compared to pre-colonial conditions. So it's almost just like, think of it in terms of you know, social distancing during COVID, where if you spread them out a little bit, the trees are going to tend to be a lot more robust. So just actually chop it hurts to look at, but just chopping a few down. But in stands where there's maybe more protections, or you know, we're still sorting through that old growth definition, so that's maybe going to change our strategy a little bit. But there are synthetic pheromones that can be sprayed into sensitive areas that are basically the antagonist of that aggregation pheromone. It lasts a few months, but if you time things right, it can be effective.
Great, thanks. I guess here we're at the end here, so I'll go ahead and close out. If you do have any remaining questions or folks that come up, feel free to email me and I can get them to speakers or answer them that I can. And if you want to be more involved with the drought early warning system, feel free to reach out as well, such as for these webinar series and things like that. So with that, I'll go ahead and close and hope everyone has a great week.